It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you at Stanford. I was here 3 years ago, and a lot has happened over the last 3 years, and I view this as an opportunity for us to exchange views with the panelists. We've already met with members of the faculty and with all of you. So in about 15 minutes, let me just dive straight in about the change that has occurred over the last 3 years. If you told me 3 years ago when I was here that today impact would be a mainstream subject of conversation, I would have been very impressed. And what we have discovered over the last 3 years, I think partly for reasons of political populism, which has been based on anti-immigration feelings, which has brought with it frustrations about the inequalities that our society creates, the disparities in the amounts held by those who were lucky enough to be able to benefit from the deployment of capital, and those who have continued to receive remuneration for their work. And all of those pressures are leading to phenomena that we cannot ignore when you look at the migration trends today, not just in countries like the United States, but across the whole of Europe now. When you look at the Brexit vote, when you look at the Gilets jaunes in France, when you look at the Trump phenomenon here in the United States, these are all examples of the consequences of our existing system. And my view is that the majority of us today feel that the world cannot go on in the way that it is doing. Something has got to change. And what I'd like to discuss with you today is what is it that has to change? Because capitalism has served us very well for 250 years, but we're at a stage where the consequences of the capitalist system are so great that governments can't cope with them. So we're finding governments across the world basically looking at social issues and environmental issues without having the tools or the resources to be able to bring credible responses to them. And philanthropists who deploy just 5% of what governments deploy on health and education alone, $500 to $600 billion a year, can't bring the answer either. And so the conclusion has to be that the private sector has to begin to get involved in finding solutions to these social and environmental issues at scale. And I started off on this trek in 2000, 18 years ago, when the government asked me in the UK to look at the issue of poverty. And for the last 18 years, I have been trying to work out how is it that our system can go through a transformation that leads to much better outcomes than we are witnessing today. And through the work of social finance, the development of the first social impact bond in 2010, where for the first time we developed a security whose financial return depended on the impact delivered. In this particular case, the Peterborough bond, how many young prisoners would go back to Peterborough jail after their release? Across the world, as most of you know, 60% go back within 18 months of release. And so we invented the first social impact bond. It was launched in 3 months, just 3 months, because an election was pending and the minister wanted it to be signed in time. And what was the result? £5 million funded 3 or 4 not-for-profits that had been dealing with prisoners for years, going cap in hand to raise donations, After 5 years, we reduced the number going back to jail by 10%, and investors made 3% a year on their money and got their money back. And through that, through the creation of Big Society Capital, the first social investment bank in the UK, which I was privileged to co-found with Nick O'Donoghue, funded by bank account money that had been separated from its owners for 15 years or more and just stayed on the balance sheets of the banks. That money was released, and with $1 billion worth of money, we created the Social Investment Bank and began to bring investment to not-for-profits. And then the G8 experience, where Matt was a very loyal partner and active partner, where we began to create boards in each of the leading industrialized countries of the world and get feedback on what was going on with social issues in these countries. And it was then that the light bulb, a second light bulb, came on after the social impact bond light bulb. And that light bulb was, you know what? Values are changing. Young people want more meaning than just making money. They want to be able to impact favorably the lives of other people. Young people connect with others in far away countries. They identify with them. And perhaps they understand that they're going to inherit a very problematic planet if nothing is done now. The second thing is older people. Older people who are making pension contributions with an eye to receiving their pension are beginning to wonder what type of a world they're going to retire in. What's the use of having a pension if you're living in a strife-torn neighborhood or country? And those pressures brought us to the conclusion that the shift which is going to happen within our system is going to be revolutionary. It may result from an evolution in thinking over several decades, but it is revolutionary in the means that it is going to bring to tackling social and environmental issues. And that is to shift our mindset from making decisions in business and in investment on the basis of just risk and return to making them on the basis of risk, return, and measurable impact. And when you begin to adopt that mindset, you begin to realize that bringing impact in changes both the risk element and the return element. And that you may be able, if you are a profit with purpose business, as we're calling them today, to grow faster and to be more profitable and to help many more people than a company that just worried about risk and return. And so when I look through the lens of the Global Steering Group today, which is working in 21 countries, soon to be 30 countries across the globe, I see young people like many of you everywhere saying, if I want to create a business, let that business help people's lives. Let it help the planet. And I'm not trading off the upside potential. I can actually think I can build a global company that helps billions of people. Maybe the definition of a new impact unicorn will be a company that's worth $1 billion, but also touches the lives of 1 billion people. And I find young people innovating. I begin to see platforms to help those who are less well off budget to refinance their loans at a lower price. I see technology coming in to help the visually impaired, a company in Israel called Orcam, founded by the entrepreneurs who sold out to Intel for $15 billion. The aunt of one of the entrepreneurs was partially blind. She asked her nephew to help her. Several years later, a couple of decades later, he felt his technology had reached the stage where he could help his aunt. So he created a pair of spectacles with an attachment that whispers into your ear the page of the book you're reading, the name of the street sign, the banknote in your hand, the goods on the supermarket shelf. Company has raised $100 million so far. The last round was a $600 million valuation, a valuation a non-impact business would have been very proud to have. But even here, to illustrate what I mean about bringing in the impact lens, if you put an impact lens on and you ask yourself the question, how can I help the maximum number of lives? It takes you beyond blind people. Maybe it takes you to saying, what if I gave a pair of these spectacles to every illiterate person in the world? Would that enable them to get a higher paying job, improve the lives of their families? And so by bringing technology for good, by bringing entrepreneurship for impact, by working through not-for-profits, where you can raise investment capital, this impact revolution is going to take place, led by the young people in this hall. And if I look ahead, the mainstream conversation has already altered capital flows. Do you know that $2 trillion of capital are potentially flowing to impact investment? We're already at a quarter of that. We can see another $1.5 trillion in the pipeline. 20 trillion have already gone to ESG investing. ESG investing where very little is measured, but where environmental, social, and governance investing, but where there is an intention to create positive impact. And for this revolution to take place, those of you who are at the business school have to focus on how we measure impact. Because if we can put impact measurement on 22 trillion of ESG money, then we will be able to compare the impact of different companies. We will look at their accounts, we will have their financial accounts and impact-weighted accounts, where their bottom line is different according to the net impact that they have delivered. Improving their sales line for the positive impact their products deliver, reducing their employment line for the positive employment impact that they deliver, and reducing their manufacturing costs for the positive environmental and social impact they deliver. And so the big challenge for us now, rather like the challenge after the 1929 crash, when our financial accounts were prepared on the basis of the accounting policies that each company chose. Each accounting firm chose. Couldn't really be compared. And after the crash, people looked at it and said, my God, we're heading for disaster if we continue with this system. We have to shift to generally accepted accounting principles that make it possible to compare the financial performance of every company. And I think the 60, 70, 80 years that have followed since then show us the path that generally accepted impact principles are going to take. We are going in the direction, and I think it'll happen within the coming decade, where companies will publish 2 sets of accounts. Employees will look at the impact-weighted profit of a company before deciding to work there. Consumers will look at the same number before deciding to purchase the products of this company, and investors will do the same. And I'll just close with my view of how this revolution is going to take place. The idea is a simple one. You optimize risk-return impact. You bring impact to the center of our consciousness. The tools for doing it are 2 broad categories of tools. Pay-for-success tools like social impact bonds, development impact bonds. My colleague, Dr. Ahmad Kabul, is here in the audience, raising $1 billion outcomes fund to pay for success securities when education attainment has improved in Africa and the Middle East. The first of many large-scale outcomes funds. The second strand is the measurement of impact within traditional investment disciplines. Private equity, impact private equity, impact venture capital, impact real estate, impact infrastructure. The movement part of it comes from consumers, employees, and interestingly, those making contributions to pension funds. How many of you in the room have deductions made from your salary, those of you who work, into a pension plan? Right? Do you know what's in your pension plan? Do you know what the portfolio of your pension plan is? Do you know what returns it's making? The movement may well come from all of you beginning to put pressure on the trustees of the pension fund to define ways of delivering the same financial return while improving lives and the planet. Now, a great economist, Adam Smith, talked about the invisible hand of markets. Had he thought of impact measurement, he might have called impact the invisible heart of markets that guides their invisible hand. Thank you. So I invite my fellow panelists.
So it's a pleasure to, and really an honor to moderate a panel with 3 pioneers in impact investing. Heidi, who was at New Island Capital, now runs a fund called Rethink Impact, and is currently teaching a class at the GSB on investing for good. Matt, as Bernadette mentioned, has just retired as the managing partner of Meteor Network. He wrote, together with some colleagues, a pioneering article in impact investing called Beyond the Returns Continuum, which I and others teach from, and is also a lecturer at the GSB, teaching assessing high-impact business models in emerging markets. And Sir Ronald Cohen has been introduced several times, but I just want to mention that he's called the father of British venture capital and the father of social investments. And one of his organizations, Bridges Funds Management, is responsible for what I think is one of the major initiatives in impact investing called the Impact Management Project, which is working on some of the issues you mentioned about how to measure impact. The only thing missing from Sir Ronald's curriculum vitae is that he's not teaching at Stanford GSB, but that may be remedied. You'll also notice that we've kind of adjusted the weather to be a welcoming place for somebody from the UK. So there are really 2 related issues that we can talk about, but I think the energy right now is for impact investing, and if we have time, we'll come to social finance. And a question I'd like to, maybe I'll begin with Heidi and Matt and then turn to you. You visited here 3 years ago, and this is a very fast-changing world. What do you think has changed in the impact investing universe over these 3 years? What do you think has changed for good, and where might you have some worries? Do you want to begin, Heidi?
Sure. I think in the last 3 years, what's been really interesting is the emergence of really large institutional scale funds that have an impact lens. So some of those, whether it's Rethink Impact, launching with over 100 million, Bain Double Impact, launching with hundreds of millions, or TPG Rise Fund, KKR, others. And I think what that's enabling is really for folks to stop thinking about impact investing as a sleeve or a pilot that exists in an endowment style portfolio, and really something to use as a lens on all of your portfolio and all the asset classes. No investment is exempt from scrutiny, using impact as a perspective. So we're seeing things like impact private credit emerge as an asset class. More and more focus on impact VC, impact private equity, ways to use real asset investing to create impact. And I think it's this growing acceptance that there's a spectrum when it comes to impact and returns. There's a way to do this work that is quasi-philanthropic. But I think more and more, as Sir Ronnie talked about, there doesn't have to be a trade-off. There can be a way to do this work where there is convergence between financial returns and high impact, transformational impact. And I think that growing recognition is something we've really seen come to the forefront in the last few years.
So before turning to Matt, you talked about the positive side. What worries you? What's the dark side of this?
I think part of it is a question of whether it's impact authenticity on the one hand, folks who are coming into the space without really having a background in impact and not knowing necessarily what the questions are to ask about impact risks, whether that's unintended consequences, mission drift, negative headlines, but also who it is that's doing the work. You know, Morgan Simon wrote in her book, that came out recently, called Real Impact, that she and others are recognizing a pattern within impact investing that mirrors what's happened in conventional finance, where there's a concentration of capital and decision-making power in the hands of a few, and few who sort of look like this panel in terms of ethnic background, classic education. And how do we pay attention to that to make sure that now that we're creating a new industry from the ground up, to make sure that we have more diverse voices included into how capital allocation decisions get made, into how products get designed.
Thank you. Matt.
Yeah, and Paul, if I may, we'll go back 10 years, not just 3, but 10 years. I'll come back to the 3-year observations. But I think we soon forget that 10 years ago, when it was about the time we became really active at the Meteor Network in this realm that's currently called impact investing, one of our objectives was to change the way people think about social change and driving positive social change. And at the time, business was really not part of that equation. It was seen as the role of government or not-for-profits. And led by many in the field, including Pierre, we said, hold on, doesn't business have a role to play? Aren't there ways to engage the private sector in driving positive social change? So from the 10-year perspective, it's actually quite amazing how far we've come. You know, that comment that business plays a role in driving positive social change, that was revolutionary 10 years ago, and now I think it's kind of generally accepted. Taking the 3-year view, I think a lot more capital has flowed in. There's ever more enthusiasm around impact investing. Sir Ronald can talk about the more global movement that we're seeing. So a lot of momentum. I have a couple of concerns that I think bear some attention. One is the discussions the debates we sometimes get in the realm of impact investing. And the most common one we get into, and we had a hint of this earlier, was can you get risk-adjusted returns, and is that still an impact investment? And we get into this, yes you can, no you can't, yes you can, no you can't. When the real view that I share is it depends. And the point isn't whether it's good or not to get those risk-adjusted returns. The point is ground yourself in what you're trying to accomplish and be very clear-eyed about what your returns are going to be as you go forward and try to accomplish that. So I think we sometimes need to move beyond the yes-no debates, such as the one we see with respect to returns. The second one, and one of the things I admire about Ronnie is he's always out ahead working on the next wave. I do think there's a lot of impact washing out there. If there's a certain positive cachet towards impact investing, and nobody's really asking you to measure what you mean by positive impact, why not raise your hands and say, yes, I'm an impact investor. If that means more money, absolutely, I'm an impact investor. I care, right? I'm a caring person, I'm an impact investor. Who's really an impact investor? What defines an impact investor? And shouldn't impact play a role in that? And shouldn't there be an expectation that if you're an impact investor, that you think seriously about impact and that you measure impact? So this whole notion of impact washing is one that concerns me. And I think the antidote to that, or the serious work that needs to be done, is digging in more on how do we define impact, how do we measure impact, and I think there's been some decent progress recently on that.
So Ronald, as the father of this field, how has your child done, for better or worse?
Well, I must say I'm very encouraged by my child's progress. I am worried about several things, but overall, I think the most important thing now is that we begin to deliver measurable impact and avoid this risk of discreditation that comes from people say everyone's talking about impact, but you look at what impact these companies are creating, they're not doing anything they weren't doing before. Impact washing, in other words. And that's why at the GSG, in partnership with the IMP, and I hope with members of the business school here, we have to find the framework for publishing impact-weighted accounts. This is the next big challenge. I feel it's an achievable challenge. I think, as I was saying in earlier comments with the faculty, I think where environmental impact is concerned, we're almost there. Employment impact, we're on the way to that. The big challenge is product impact. And for those of you who are going to move into the big data area, it may well be that big data, artificial intelligence type tools enable us to get to a feedback loop from consumers about value for money, affordability, and so on. So we have to think with the new tools we have. So I think impact washing is the most worrying thing. I have to say that having lived through the birth of venture capital, I see great parallels. The challenge when venture capital started was that there weren't enough entrepreneurs around to invest in. And most investors said, I'm going to wait until this gets going before I get involved. A small number of investors, including Tom Judge, who was the leader of the AT&T pension fund, said, this is going to work. I have faith it's going to work, and I'm going to get an allocation to fund people like Heidi here, who are setting up professional funds that are going to deliver entrepreneurs that can change the world, basically. And I think allocations by investors, Paul, are something that we've got to try to come to now. It's very difficult for Heidi, for Bridges, for Leapfrog, for Avishkar to go to institutional investment managers and say, give us money. Because today they say, well, it's neither traditional venture capital or private equity, nor do we have an allocation to something called impact. So it's very difficult to raise money. And so my second fear is that we don't scale fast enough that we can begin to prove the proposition that you can deploy significant capital, that there are entrepreneurs like Elon Musk who want to make a ton of money, but at the same time want to change the world for the better, transform it for the better.
So there seems to be a consensus that for all of the advances in the field, that the concern about impact washing remains one, and that the solution is impact measurement or impact weighted accounts. You can think of impact in two different categories. One is the investee enterprise, the business in which you're investing. Is it producing valuable social outputs? And then you can think about the impact of the investment itself. Let's begin with the investee's impact. And there's a new organization which comes out of TPG Rise called Y Analytics, which is trying, I think, to bring to the impact investing field the same kinds of measurements of outcomes as philanthropy has brought to its grantees for many years. Do you have a sense of where that's going and how it's doing?
Yeah, no, I'm involved in advising Y Analytics. I think they have arrived at a way of measuring impact and expressing it as a multiple of capital invested that is workable. It's easier to do within a private equity framework where most companies will be single product companies rather than multi-product companies. And I think it'll work. I think the system will get refined with inputs from many other organizations, but it is necessary. And what is fascinating about TPG is in the space of 3 years, they will have raised $5 billion for impact private equity. $5 billion. If you told me that when I was here 3 years ago, I would have thought you were dreaming. $5 billion. And so I think, Paul, we all have to do, as we did with venture capital, we all have to do the effort, to make the effort, to try to improve this measurement dimension. It will come from many different areas. When I started off in venture capital, we measured only IRR. Then we got to a multiple of the capital invested. In the end, it was both these parameters that interested investors, and it settled down around that. I think we're going to go through trial and error with impact measurement. And it behoves us all, particularly as prestigious a business school as Stanford, it behoves us all to help to address these issues.
Heidi and Matt, what do you think about the issue of measuring the impact of the enterprises?
I mean, I think it's obviously, it's really important. I do think it's critical to achieve scale, and impact investing will fail if we're not able to attract trillions of dollars of inflows into the market. If we cannot pull commercial capital into this space, we will not solve these problems. And I think impact measurement is critical to making that happen. I think the trick is trying to find a methodology that's rigorous enough to be meaningful, but practical enough to be repeatable. And so whether Y Analytics has landed on it, Gears has tried this, Iris tried this, and I think there are real practicalities that are worth thinking about. Whether small, under-resourced firms can hire consultants to implement a complicated methodology, or if money is better spent by focusing on the large funds that do have those types of budgets. But thinking about how can we really make sure that a methodology is rigorous, but really executable by smaller, under-resourced firms is going to be really critical, I think, to seeing its scale.
Matt?
Yeah, I would agree with what's said. I would note that Y Analytics has already made a significant contribution to the field, and there's a lot to do.
Yeah.
And there are going to be a whole host of different approaches that we'll all have to sort through and see which is most applicable depending upon the situation. And it's not going to be easy. At the end of the day, one of the expressions is impact is in the eye of the beholder. What means something to Sir Ronald as a significant impact in somebody's life may not mean that to somebody else in the audience. So there are a whole host of issues. We've got to take on this issue. Significant progress is being made. There's a lot to be done. I think we're still in the very sort of early innings of the impact measurement.
But it's just worth emphasizing Matt's point that impact is in the eye of the beholder. Risk-adjusted financial returns can be estimated across every investment in the world. Impact, the social impact depends on what your goals are, and you may be interested in Sustainable Development Goals. You may be interested in working neighborhoods in the UK or in health in a US city, and those are different goals. One thing that I think the impact community has not focused on yet is the unintended negative consequences of some impact-oriented businesses. I wonder whether you've addressed that question.
I think when you're dealing with lives, unintended consequences are crucially important. And certainly in the pay for success field, with social impact bonds and development impact bonds, it's something that is central to the design of these securities. I think when we are talking of impact ventures, such as those people in the audience today might plan to set up, trying to address a social issue or an environmental issue in health or in education or in any other issue that you're passionate about, does not involve having to prove that everything that is going to result from your organization is going to be positive impact. And I think when we talk about impact, there is a danger that we view it as the philosopher's stone, able to deliver more than a normal profit for purpose business, and through its accounting somehow to account for long-term as well as short-term impact. And I think we have to be more measured in our objectives. I think for me, what impact investment means, or impact entrepreneurship means, is the intention to address a social issue in an effective way, measuring the financial return and the impact created. And I think over time, as we are finding with social media companies today, our perception of the impact created may change. We may consider that at the beginning a company is delivering great impact and its accounting will reflect that, and then over time it drifts away from that in one way or another, expected or unexpected, and the accounting will need to reflect that at the time. But we cannot today, in trying to prepare the accounts of a social media company, expect to include in its sales line the product impact over the next 20 years. And so I think, Paul, it's important for us to simplify and to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of a corporation? Is it if it has food products? Is it just to feed people in high-income countries? If it begins to feed people in low-income countries, will we encourage that by giving them a boost to their sales line? Because if you begin to provide product to low-income countries, then you're possibly solving issues of nutrition and so on and so forth. And I think starting from something like that, or starting with the impact on water utilization, the impact on the training of the unemployed, starting with these issues, begin to put together metrics that we will build up over time.
I mean, what's important is the way you phrased what is the purpose of the corporation, is all of your answers assume we've moved beyond Milton Friedman saying the only purpose of the corporation is to provide money for its shareholders.
Yeah. When I spoke at the Y Analytics meeting in Davos, Bob Zimmer, who is the head of Chicago University, as you may know, was there. And I referred to the fact that it was rather nice that he was in the audience, because Chicago had famously come up with the Milton Friedman doctrine. But interestingly, I said, Chicago also came up with the concept of risk measurement and risk-adjusted returns. And as you were saying before, Paul, we don't measure risk very accurately, but risk thinking changed the face of investment portfolios across the world. It opened the door to all of us on this panel Because if you didn't have you didn't live through that period, and I did, but a typical portfolio when I kicked off in my mid-20s for a big pension fund was 70% bonds and 30% equities, all of your own country. There was no concept of diversification. And Chicago brought the concept of risk-adjusted thinking. So I think the Friedman doctrine is behind us. I think the world is going to have to move beyond it in order to right all of the ills that confront us today. But the University of Chicago may yet be able to get a Nobel Prize for optimizing risk, return, and impact.
In the 5 minutes before we then turn to questions from the audience, the very rapid capitalization of the TPG Rise Fund can be regarded as a success, but it could also be regarded as a worry with respect to impact washing. And let me turn briefly to the question of the impact of the investment itself. We know what it means to make a difference for the investee organization, for the business you're investing in. For the investor, what makes a difference is you're doing something more than the ordinary commercial investors would do. Is there a potential worry, and let me begin with Matt and Heidi, and then probably finish with Sir Ronald. Is there a worry that large funds like TPG Rise are really not doing anything different in terms of impact than lots of other emerging funds that have no impact claims?
It depends, and in full disclosure, Pierre was a anchor investor in the TPG Rise Fund, and I was familiar with it. I think it depends upon the organization. My sense, and knowing the leadership of the TPG Rise Fund, is they actually do add value through those investments. Not only, it actually begins even in the process of due diligence. If you do your due diligence well, you're creating making a very significant financial investment. You frequently are able to raise a whole host of questions to that potential investee that are meaningful to their business. Then there are a whole host of questions around what happens post-investment. And again, I guess I'm just a little biased because I know the folks at TPG that they like to engage with their investees post-investment. Certainly at the Mini-R Network, when we invested early stage, even those firms where we co-invested with other VCs who were just looking at financial returns, if we were able to get on the board, we absolutely felt like we could add value to the firm and enable them to become more successful. And frequently, to the extent we were on the board and we were focused on impact, there was also an important voice to have on the board of directors, because not everybody on the board of directors would necessarily have an impact orientation. So having an investor that has an impact orientation, and perhaps it's a little self-serving for me to say that, but I like to think that was valuable to the firm in which we invested. So I think it's a great question. I think there are probably a number of situations where a firm that is doing good in the world is able to attract plenty of capital, and so where the impact investment may not be additive, but I think there are a whole host of situations and periods of time in the firm's evolution where absolutely that impact investment and the people who are actually making those investments can add a ton of value to that organization.
Yeah. Heidi?
I mean, I think certainly TPG Rise has had a net positive impact on the market. You know, certainly there are those who I think criticize from the outside that they are taking what the growth fund would have done anyway and reclassifying those into the Rise Fund. And so I think, but you know, they have been extremely well capitalized, right? And so I don't know enough about the portfolio to pass judgment on that from the outside. You know, I do worry a bit that other institutions will see that race to AUM and want to be a part of it and won't replicate some of the things that TPG Rise has done so thoughtfully, whether it's around Y Analytics, whether it's hiring folks like Rick Needham or Maya Chirengal or Taryn Goodman, who have been leaders and pioneers within the impact space and bringing them in and integrating them into the investment selection process. I don't know if other firms will take as thoughtful of an approach. And I do worry that, you know, perhaps the market, because it is still new and growing, doesn't have the absorptive capacity to have TPG Rise replicate itself 10 times over today. I mean, certainly we see mega funds within the early stage VC space really distorting with what's happening within seed stage investing, Series A investing, where fund size is dictating investment strategy versus the other way around. So I see things like that happening within classic venture. I worry that this race to AUM, led by this incredible example of TPG Rise and how quickly it's grown, may replicate itself within the impact space. And I think what's important for us as practitioners and for all of you as future practitioners is to keep up the heat, keep up the inquiry into how the decisions are made, how the strategies get formed, and how the investments are selected.
Sir Ronald, why don't you take the last word on this, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
So I would say I agree with everything that's been said by the panel. I would say that impact investment is a response to the needs of impact entrepreneurs who want to improve lives and the planet, in a similar way that venture capital and NASDAQ were for tech entrepreneurs. And that it's very difficult to separate a market into its components. We need change at the investor level, we need change at the investment manager level, and we need change at the entrepreneurial level. And I'm glad to say that this change is beginning to be visible at scale. So let's not seek perfection. Let's seek to scale. Let's multiply the examples that prove to the world that it is possible to make money and to help others, to do good and to do well at the same time.
A great benediction before now we're ready to take some questions from the audience. I see somebody right in the middle up front.
Radhika Shah, co-president of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. I have a question around the SDGs for Sir Ronald Cohen. Do you see the SDGs as, since they're a normative framework that most world leaders have adopted, can they be brought in to bring into the corporate charter, whether it's a company or an institution or a venture capital firm, that purpose and intentionality for impact is there, even if it's not in accounting? And also the second question is there a way that the impact investing industry can tackle the issues that have been there in philanthropy around agency and agency not being as strong across all the stakeholders and be more egalitarian? Is there something that can be done with SDGs and technology in that space?
So I think the SDGs are very important. And when we're thinking in terms of impact accounting frameworks like impact-weighted financial accounts, I think it's very important that they translate into a monetary contribution to achieving the SDG goals. The SDGs have become a sort of North Star now for a lot of corporations and for a lot of investors, and we should build on that.
Thank you very much. My name is Matthias. I'm a second-year MBA student. So we talked that in order to this revolution to happen, we need measurement and more money. My question is, what is the role of governments and policy, and what is the state in this thing?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I started off with government as a partner, but if you look today at where government is following rather than leading in the impact space. And so out of 135 social impact bonds in 26 countries, more than 90% have been paid for by government. It's been long, laborious, and difficult. And so now we're beginning to say, let's have governments as partners. Let's not expect them to do everything. Let's have them pay for 15% of the outcomes. Let philanthropists come in and provide the other 85% of the outcomes. So the answer is, governments are crucial. If you don't get them as partners, you'll achieve very little. But if you rely on them as partners, you'll rely on them to do everything, you will achieve even less. So at the moment, we're focusing on partnership with government, working through the G7, working through the G20. different countries. Argentina, I don't know if you come from Argentina. Argentina is a country where impact investment is taking root. We're seeing legislation come in different countries. Half a dozen countries have created impact wholesalers like Big Society Capital. The UK liberated £400 million, $600 million for Big Society Capital, the social investment bank. Japan is liberating $4.5 billion for a similar purpose. And so it's very important to keep governments in, but how you get them to lead when in their mind it involves doing new things which are still not proven is a big question.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground in 1 hour. Thank you, Sir Ronald and Heidi Patel and Matt Bannick.
Thank you, Paul.